Hi, everyone. My name is Zoe Ryder. I'm the interim representative to the U.S. for Transparency International. Really happy to see you all here. Really happy that you come out to hear our colleagues and anti-corruption champions, just rights-based activists who are all sort of part of the same questions that are at dawn of our time. And just to say that this is our second Democracy Dialogue, which is an event series that was launched in December by Global Integrity, Sunlight Foundation, and the Open Gov Hub in collaboration with Transparency International. This dialogue series, there's going to be at least 12, was born out of an increasing sense among American U.S. civil society that American democracy, let's say, is having a tough time. If you disagree with that, let me know. I think that's an okay way to put it. And no groaning, but yes, calls to unrig the system and drain the swamp that characterized the 2016 elections are the obvious indicator of the loss of public trust in our public institutions. But this wave of sentiment is not coming from nowhere. To be sure, academics, civil society, investigative reporters have been addressing the ways in which our elected officials from both parties are increasingly captured by donor interests for decades. But, you know, when we grew up, I grew up in New York, public education, we were educated to have an unwavering belief in the capacity of our democratic institutions, especially our system's capacity of checks and balance to counter the undue influence in our political system of special interest. Today, I'm not sustained by that belief, and I don't think many of us here are. So how did we get here? What can we learn from civil society around the world that have and are facing similar threats? To help American civil society tackle those threats here at home, that's the central question that guides these dialogues. Though I suggest that the learning goes both ways, and I've seen that in the last couple of days when my European colleagues have met with U.S. anti-corruption activists, and we've had many of our own aha moments. So what's the measure of success for these dialogues? We do have one. It was introduced by John Wunderlich, the executive director of Sunlight. It's how many of us are going to walk out of here today with at least one new idea or thought about how we might be able to tweak our own approaches to fighting corruption or strengthening our democracy. That's the measure of success. So let us know. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to my co-conspirator and the moderator for this event, Nora.
Let's see, can you all hear me okay? So yeah, good afternoon, welcome. I'm really, really delighted to have you all here. Again, my name is Nora Zohdy. I'm the director here of the Open Gov Hub, and I've also been leading the organizing of this Defending Democracy program. And I'm really, really delighted to have this discussion with you all today, featuring 6 really exceptional panelists, almost all of whom have traveled quite a far distance actually to be with us today, whether from Budapest, Brussels, London, Los Angeles, or Vancouver, or Washington, D.C. Really, really delighted to have each of them here today to reflect on our topic for today, which is really understanding this phenomenon of populism in Europe and in the United States and its relationships to corruption. And so, of course, in the spirit of our Defending Democracy program, this is really meant to be a comparative discussion, one focused on kind of peer learning and what new insights can we glean basically from connecting the dots about what is happening here at home and around the world. And so that's really the spirit we want to carry all of these endeavors with. I will also begin with the caveat that I think hearing each of these individuals just talk about the topic maybe for 2 hours on their own, I'm sure would be a delight, but clearly we can't afford to do that today. So with that being said, we have kind of designed a pretty, facilitated discussion for the next hour with our 6 panelists, and we will leave good room for discussion to hear from you all as well. So let me go ahead and just introduce who we have featured here today, and then we'll kick things off. 3 of our panelists will be, reflecting primarily on the experience of populism and corruption here in the United States, and 3 in the European context. And so just starting, we'll go down the line just to give quick introductions. Immediately to my left is Nora Gilbert, who is joining us from Represent Us, which is the nation's largest grassroots anti-corruption campaign organization, which brings together Americans from across the political spectrum to pass anti-corruption laws. And so she's their director of strategic projects and partnerships. So thanks for joining us, Nora. Next, we have Duncan Haynes, who is a chartered management accountant and former member of parliament, who now leads the policy, advocacy, and research for Transparency International in the UK. Next is Janine Vidal. She's a social anthropologist and a professor at the School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, where she focuses on governance, corruption, shadow and influence elites, and accountability. Then we'll have Carl Dolan, who is the director of the Transparency International EU chapter, and he's been the director since 2013. Prior to that, he worked with the UK Research Council, the European Commission, and the European Foundation. Being here, Carl. Next, we have Tony McAleer. I probably didn't say that. McAleer. There we go.
I didn't have a single homeland. I got it right up first.
Thank you for being generous. So yeah, Tony is a former organizer for the White Aryan Resistance and a former skinhead recruiter, who is now executive director of an organization called Life After Hate, which was created by former members of the radicalized American far-right movement in order to educate people about the threats of violence. Tony, thanks for being here. And finally, we have Jozsef Peter Martin, who is an economist and sociologist, and the executive director of Transparency International in Hungary, where he's been leading that since 2016. So again, thank you all for joining us. Really delighted to hear from you. So now, just to go ahead and kick things off, I wanted to ask each of the panelists to begin your remarks by just giving us an introduction to how you came into the work that you're doing as it relates to this topic. And I will say that I'm assuming that everyone here in this room has maybe never been part of a conversation before with quite this unique mix of backgrounds and perspectives. And that was really quite intentional. So we really are trying to push towards bringing new ideas and perspectives and coalitions that can respond to the challenges that we're facing here and around the world. So that was intentional and really excited to hear from your unique background. So with that, Nora, do you want to start off?
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me, and thanks for doing this after the bomb cyclone. But yeah, really happy to miss that. So, as you mentioned, I'm the Director of Strategic Projects and Partnerships at Represent Us. I'm based in Los Angeles, but our organization is based in Northampton, Massachusetts, so we have grassroots activists all over the country that work with us. I came to this work after several years in food and agriculture policy, a bit of an unexpected twist. And I got to the point where I realized that what was broken in food policy was not something that we were ever going to fix in food policy, because the break was far more upstream in the way that we made policy in the country and in the way that, for example, members of the Senate Agriculture Committee can effectively be bought and sold by corporate agribusiness and exchange for favors. And we were never going to get the type of food system I was working toward without curbing the corrupting influence of money in politics. So I looked around and saw the same thing happening in other issues I cared about, from education to healthcare to how our tax dollars were spent, and just was very bothered by this misalignment between what I saw as my values and American values, and just not being represented in our policies. So I came to Represent Us to join this effort because I wanted to be a part of a movement that was working on this from a very structural reform mindset, and from the recognition that this isn't about individual bad actors making bad decisions, but about a broken system that enables this to happen and incentivizes bad behavior. So that's how I got here.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak with us. Transparency International in the United Kingdom has been working on corruption for a long time, and we also take a close interest at the way our politics works in the UK and vulnerabilities to corruption in our political system. And so given the prominent role that populism has played in the recent democratic events, it became inevitable that we found ourselves looking at the interplay between the phenomena. And we had two major innovations in our electoral cycle in the United Kingdom: the referendum in Scotland of whether it was going to remain in the United Kingdom, certain flavour of nationalist identity and political campaigning. And then soon afterwards, we had the referendum in which the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union, Brexit as it's known. And it was in researching the campaign finance for that period and for the Brexit referendum, a report that we published soon after I joined Transparency, Take Back Control. We started to see some of the innovation, how those campaigns had been and we still struggle with the aftermath of that in terms of the changed political discourse in the United Kingdom, a society that politically, in just the space of 2 or 3 years, has become substantially more polarized, one in which the public political debate has stoked division, and the way the debate has been conducted online provides both evidence that that has been the case, but also through recent investigation of the origins of some of that activity, including fake online accounts operated from locations well outside of the EU, including Russian Federation. We've seen much greater hostility to participants in the democratic process, and especially online, directed against women leading in political argument and debate. And as I say, the very tone of our politics has been changed. And what I hope to explore with you this afternoon is what we've learned about some of the background of some of the new players in those political contexts, and what we're learning about some of the motivation driving those changes.
I'm Janine Vidal. I'm delighted to see a panel organized on this subject of bringing together populism and corruption, bringing them together, and I'm honored to be part of this panel. I started thinking about corruption in the West after spending many years in Eastern Europe. My early career was in Poland under communism as a young social anthropologist, looking at the networks of exchange, which were actually quite benign and were just ways of surviving for most people. Then, after the communism began to crumble, I charted the elite power networks that developed, that actually then ran the first post-communist governments of Poland in particular. And I began to see the networks of, say, an elite group that works together in privatizing resources for itself, is working in international banking, international foundations, and at the same time really has its own agenda in mind rather than that of the public. And so that is the model of elite cliques that I saw. Fast forward a number of years when I came back and was fully based again in the United States in Washington, especially in the late 1990s and early 2000s. I saw the same kinds of cliques developing here around the economic agenda and also around taking the United States to war in Iraq. So since then, I've written several books, Shadow Elite, on new shadow influence elites, essentially establishment corruption, and the latest Unaccountable, which really lays out how these establishment elites are operating in the West in different arenas, including think tanks and universities and consultancies, etc. So, corruption in the West.
Yeah, and actually, lots to talk about as you're getting the mic on. Just a reminder, I forgot to mention earlier, we do have a hashtag for this event and this full series, so would love to have you all take the conversation to Twitter. So it's hashtag Democracy Dialogue. And finally, just a quick reminder too that we'll wrap up the panel at 6 o'clock, but we will have a reception immediately follow. So definitely feel free to save additional questions that you'd like to bring and stick around to join us for food and drink and further discussion. So anyway, now you should be good, Carl.
Yeah. Quick switcheroo. So my name is Carl Dolan. I'm the director of the Transparency International EU office in Brussels, as you just heard. And so I've come to this topic because we deal with the EU. I think one of the first things you need to understand about the nature of populism in Europe is how heterogeneous it is. There's very little that unites, say, populists in Spain, Podemos, and UK independence parties. But it's difficult to imagine anything that they could agree on, except for one thing, which is that they all hate the EU. And they hate the EU for different reasons. So populists of the left hate it because they think it's a stalking horse for multinationals and for free market economics. Populists of the right hate it because they think it's talk about human rights, fundamental rights, something that is infringing on their sovereignties and their programs, which makes you think that the EU must be doing something right if there's such varying opinions on what it's there for. So, and unlike national institutions or domestic institutions which populists would like to take over, the EU, I think they would just like to abolish completely. The EU doesn't have those kind of deep roots and affections that national institutions have. And as somebody who works with an anti-corruption organization with the EU, I think that would be a bad thing, because I think, on the whole, on balance, with some device, the EU has been very good for anti-corruption issues across Europe. And I think there's no better proof of that than the fact that you look at the banner behind you that actually paid for this part of this event today. But more seriously, I think the difference, arguably the difference between a country like Lithuania and Ukraine has been the EU accession process. So the difference in standards of governance and rule of law between those two countries has been the EU accession process. So. And the other reason that I'm concerned about this is that we in our daily work in Brussels, we have to deal with populists all the time. 25% of the members of the European Parliament come from populist parties, and I can tell you that they're not particularly pleasant people to deal with. So that is our inspiration for linking these two subjects.
I'm Tony McAleer, co-founder and board chair. I fired myself and hired a real executive director of Life After Hate. And Life After Hate was started as an online journal in 2009. Became 501c3 in 2011. And all of the founders of it are people that were members of the violent far right in the white supremacist movement. And what we do is we help people get out of those groups, assist people who we help people who are where we once were. So we look to disrupt that space by doing that through outreach, intervention, and social media strategies. The other part of it we do is we educate and inform research, policy, law enforcement, communities, campuses that are having to deal with that problem in their community and how to most effectively deal with that. And so we're sort of at the coal face of dealing with populism in its most ugly expression. There's the whole spectrum to populism. We do at the end that is violence as a part of intolerance and such, and that's sort of the space where we work. And we, it's funny, in the not funny, but in the last election cycle, that's where we started to get a lot of uptick and people reaching out to us. But what started to happen in that cycle was people reaching out on behalf of somebody else, my brother, my friend, uncle. People were concerned about them. So in that last election cycle, we started to experience that family type of counseling, which I've been done before. It's really changed a lot of things. I almost have a interesting perspective. We're based in Chicago. The work we do is primarily in the United States, but I live across that imaginary line called the border in Vancouver, and so I get to, in a way, look at the politics and everything from a dispassionate point of view. Because Justin Trudeau is my prime minister. I was going to get a shirt, Trump, not my prime minister, and so I can look at it in a slightly dispassionate way. Because, I wake up with a different leader than you do every morning, and so that provides me with that experience with which I'll share with you.
Well, to everybody, my name is Jozsef Martin. I am Managing Director of Transparency International Hungary, and thank you very much for the invitation. I am very happy to share my thoughts about the Central European, Eastern European, and the Hungarian problems, and about corruption and populism, which are both very, very actual current context at that part of the world, and also, of course, as it was already mentioned, there is a general trend of surge of populism. As many as 89% of the Hungarians think that populism is a big problem in Hungary, according to Eurobarometer survey, which is much, much above the EU average. So I think there is a big need to talk about it, to raise awareness, and to make as much as it is possible to counter it. As far as my previous engagement with anti-corruption is concerned, I also have to tell that beforehand I worked as journalist, economic journalist mainly. I was editor-in-chief of a business magazine in Hungary, and even at that time we were dealing with lots of investigative stories. It was between 2003 and 2009. At that time, the corruption was also a big problem. So corruption is traditionally has been a big problem in Hungary. It's not a new phenomenon, although, and we will elaborate on that, after 2010, the nature of corruption significantly changed in my country. So, but even before 2010, I was dealing with investigative stories, and we got the Pulitzer Memorial Prize in 2006 for an investigative story. And when this opportunity came across in 2013, I was delighted to accept it, to be the managing director of Transparency International Hungary, because I saw already at that time, and since that I've seen day by day to what extent corruption and is putting backwards the development of Hungary, both in terms of economy and.
Thank you all. So now, just to kind of jump right into the heart of the matter, I think probably what's on the forefront of everyone's mind here is really just trying to better understand this populist trend, right? So the first kind of key question I'd like to ask is, why populism here in the United States and abroad, and why now? And again, recognizing that each of you are coming to this topic from unique vantage points, but for example, some of you may have heard that the Cambridge Dictionary declared populism word of the year in 2017, et cetera. It's clearly something that's so relevant and timely to so many of our headlines in so many contexts. So I'm just jumping right in. For each of you, what do you see really as the key drivers behind this phenomenon in the context that you focus on? And maybe we'll have Janine, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Is this microphone on, or did you give it to me because it's working? Okay, you would do that. All right. Yeah, so thank you. So first off, I would challenge the use of the widespread use of the term populism. I think this isn't your grandfather's populism. I think what we're seeing are anti-system movement, people knocking on the door of the system and trying to get in, and just wanting to get rid of the system without necessarily any notion of what to replace it with. Trump's healthcare initiatives to get rid of the Obamacare are a good example of that, without concrete ideas of what to replace it with and how to do it. Just people knocking on the door of the system, wanting to get rid of it. These movements, we're talking about not just electorates, not just voters, we're talking about widespread movements across societies. So again, I think to think about these as anti-system, anti-establishment, and anti-elite movements, I think encompasses a lot of what we're seeing. Why is this happening? Well, one thing that we've seen pretty much worldwide, and which is especially striking in Western democracies, is the decline in trust in public institutions, whether we're talking about institutions of government, courts, parliaments, presidencies, or of corporations. Big banks have lost public trust, or whether we're talking about the media. It's across the board. And what's striking to me is that, while I lived under communism, so of course under communism, people had very little faith in the system that it could actually deliver. People didn't believe in it. But in the West, 30 years ago, people actually believed in civic institutions. Even certainly in the United States, we've seen this decline. But even in places like Sweden, you see, and Canada, by the way, you see these declines in trust. So that's one. Coupled with that development is the huge increase in income inequality, which is coupled with a third development, which is elite corruption, which is related, in my view, to the first two. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes.
Pass it along either direction, but we'd love to hear from each of you. And let me give you the other mic. We can.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I agree with all that, of course, and maybe just to add to that from a European perspective is that the question why populism now has to be, I think, nuanced a bit in the European context, because actually we've been living with populism in Europe for at least 25 years. In some ways, a politician like Silvio Berlusconi in Italy is the archetype for somebody like Trump. So, and I think this is, we've seen this particularly in the Eastern European region. Jozsef spoke with a bit more expertise on that than I can. And I think that looking at why Eastern Europe was so prone to populist parties, we might look at the way that the whole idea of choice between economic alternatives was removed from debate in Eastern Europe, partly as a result actually of the EU accession process, which I talked about earlier. Maybe this is one of the negative sides of the EU accession process, but essentially the economic policies that were put in place in Eastern Europe were seen as necessary rather than things that could be a matter of democratic debate or choice. And I think when that's removed, you do get this sense of frustration, both as channeled into anti-system or anti-establishment parties. And I think in Western Europe, I think we've also seen a 20-year period where the idea of viable alternatives to the economic system were taken off the table, taken off the agenda in democratic politics. And I think that the reason that now this whole issue has become the populism that has taken command of this issue is partly because of the financial crisis, or rather the lack of an adequate response to the financial crisis. And so what should have demanded a proper economic response is actually we only saw business as usual from much of the business class, much of the, we've seen anesthesia from central banks and such like, but we haven't really seen the political class tackle the fundamental problems which the financial crisis laid bare. So that would be my what Janine's analysis would be.
I look at, I often hear people say, populism is anti-democratic. And I believe populism is an essential part of democracy, in that it's like the check engine light coming on in your car. And when it shows up and it goes on, there's something systemically wrong with your engine. So you're going for fixed. And, I think sometimes if we ignore that light and continue to go on without addressing those systemic problems, run into a much worse problem. And I think the challenge is populism, I don't think hardly ever has the right answer to the problems in society, but it certainly often asks the right question. And I think you brought up several key points there, which I think are very valuable. So in that way, it's telling us that there's something wrong and it needs to be addressed. I think in the recent election here, you had the choice between the wrong answer and being told you're stupid for asking a question. And I think we need to look and we need to listen. We don't necessarily accept, but we listen to the grievances of people that are expressing that. And they can inform us great what we need to do.
So definitely, I think that there are common tendencies across the Western world in broad sense of surge of populism. But before we draw too many parallels, I would just say that at least in two things, I think there are clear differences between the surge of populism in the West and in the East. One is the populism, the pluralism, and the second is the institutional resistance, so the resistance of the institution towards these tendencies. Let me tell you examples from the Hungarian context. If you live in Hungary, outside Budapest, outside the capital, then you can consume only those media outlets which are, or only those broadcasters which are in the hands of the government, apart from one national private broadcaster, which is owned by a German group. Otherwise, all the broadcasters and all the local newspapers are captured by the government, which I think would be unimaginable in the western part of the world. And the second is the institutional resistance to populism, and also, which is in line with that, elaborated afterwards, of systemic corruption. So the other is the institutions. So the institutions have been also captured in my country. We are saying that there is a state capture situation, which basically means that all the state organs, state institutions serve as an instrument of the executive power and not as a control of the executive power. So I'm speaking about prosecution, I'm speaking about the central bank, I'm speaking about the state audit office. So I could at least all the state sphere, apart from perhaps one. These are the law courts. The law courts, the judges are still independent. So I do not want to undermine and undervalue the threat of populism in the Western world, but I would say that there are still differences. And if the question is why Fidesz, the current governing party in Hungary, how could they win the power with a populist agenda in 2010 and get 2/3 of parliamentary mandate and supermajority with which they can change the constitution. So I think here the answer is quite complex. One answer is that Fidesz has been a populist party for a long time, so well beyond before 2010. They were populist even in the opposition. Just one example to cite is that they wanted at the same time austerity when there were economic discussion, and at the same time more transfer to the more social transfer. So they were clearly advocating populist agenda before, when they were in opposition. The second thing is that unfortunately the governments until 2010, or at least the last two governments until 2010, they didn't deliver as much as they could. And the bad governance and the flawed economic policies started also well beyond 2010. And the third one, which was already mentioned, this is the global crisis, the global economic crisis. But having said that, I also would add that in general, I do not think that everything can be explained by the economic crisis. So I think that in general terms, the surge of populism, I'm not speaking anymore only about Hungary, but in general terms, it's a combination of the economic factors and the cultural backlash.
Yes, Nora.
Is this working? Yeah, very well. To go back to the American context, I want to underscore some of Janine's points. And The Economist about a year ago released their democracy index, and for the first time downgraded the United States from a full democracy to a flawed democracy, largely due to the staggeringly low levels of trust that the American people have in our civic institutions, in our government, and our elected officials. And none of this is surprising if you think about this. There's a Princeton study from a few years ago that said that the preferences of the average American have a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy. And when you think about that in the context of that staggeringly low trust, it makes sense that people are upset and see a government that doesn't seem to be working for them and their families the way that it does for the wealthy and powerful. So I think that perception of a broken government is, of course, a driver of populism. And I would also echo the point that at least what we're talking about that represent us is much more the rise of an anti-establishment sentiment than populism itself. And while corruption is a driver of populism, that the anti-establishment sentiment is not just a helpful, but really an essential component of meaningful anti-corruption work. And it's a very powerful tool that this movement can use in building grassroots activism to pass state and local laws and go around Congress. And it's a very exciting opportunity and a great window to start approaching it that way. So I think obviously populism can manifest in a lot of negative ways as well. And this particular threat of this anti-establishment moment is, even if it's not necessarily giving us the solutions, it's definitely giving us an organizing tactic and a call to action and an approach that is very galvanizing for people across the country who feel like the government just isn't giving them what them and their families need and what they feel they deserve. So there's that element to it as well.
Thank you. So I would accept that today's populists are anti the system, as you say, Janine, and anti-establishment. But you can be anti-establishment and anti the system without being either populist or popular. I know I was for several years, and so I think we need to ask ourselves what other characteristics define today's populists. And I think there is something about populism which rests on scapegoating, on identifying the other, on dividing rather than uniting. goodness, I was anti-establishment and I had complicated constitutional solutions. And those are not the emblem of today's populists. It is much simpler to point at your scapegoat and to make people feel they have less in common with it. In the United Kingdom, those two examples I gave you of populism in Scotland and anti-European or anti-European Union populism, in both cases it followed over a long period of time of ordinary politicians, shall we say, not recognisably populist, scapegoating either one of the alternative institutions. In the case of Scotland, scapegoating the Westminster political system as being the reason for Scotland's woes, or in the case of often conservative opinion in the United Kingdom, blaming the European Union for things being the way they are, even if people didn't like it. And it's off the back of that history of blame that created fertile ground for the current brand of populism we had. Just one other point I wanted to make, which is not to dispute these answers we've heard about the causes of populism, but to point to an element which needs to be talked about how it has been fueled. Carl said it's very hard to find anything in common between some of the divergent brands of populism in Europe, and he would probably recognise that in relation to the Scottish nationalists and the anti-European Union party UKIP. But I found one thing which does unite both of those populist political movements that wanted to disrupt the established status quo of United Kingdom. And that is that the leaders of both movements, Alex Salmond in the case of the Scottish nationalists and Nigel Farage in the case of the UK Independence Party, both were very popular with the editors of a broadcast channel, RT, Russia Today. This outlet, a propaganda arm of the Russian Federation, pays politicians in the United Kingdom appearance fees, and even in the case most recently of Alex Salmond, his own show on their channel. And in doing so, these populist politicians are actually taking the Kremlin's coin. And whilst I will credit the Kremlin with causing populism in the United Kingdom, it has certainly suited their interests, the interests of that regime, to give airtime to and encourage the divisive arguments that those populists have, divisive and disruptive arguments that those populists have offered in our public debate.
Thank you. So a number of you have begun to address this already, but but I'd like to just delve a little more directly in exploring this relationship more that you perceive between populism and corruption, and kind of where, you know, if it is indeed true that the opinions of kind of average citizens are so irrelevant when it comes to policy making, and that, you know, the kind of interests of elites are really what's driving the show. Does that explain the full story when we're trying to understand the connection between populism and corruption, or is there more to add? Yeah, maybe Carl, do you want to start us off from, again, this kind of EU regional perspective?
Yeah, well, I suppose the way I would address this question is, you know, why should I take a professional interest in this as somebody who's part of an anti-corruption organization, rather than as somebody who's simply a concerned citizen? And I think there are at least three very good reasons why an organization like Transparency International should concern itself with the rise of populist movements. And the first reason is that corruption is the fuel of populism. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the difficulties of a populist party or an insurgency movement to try and fund itself, there is a great temptation, to say the least, on behalf of a number of these movements to, should we say, bend the rules around party financing and around the rules around how campaign financing for example, in order to equip themselves to attain their objectives. I mean, Duncan has already mentioned some of the work that we at Transparency International have done around the financing for the Brexit referendum. But there are other good examples of that from around Europe. Perhaps some of the one of the most well-known stories about how the Front National in France funded itself primarily through a loan from a Moscow-based Russian bank, First National Bank. And while there's nothing intrinsically illegal about this transaction, it was rather notable that the loan came shortly after Marine Le Pen gave her public support for the annexation of Crimea. Even though, as I said, populist parties like the UK Independence Party and the Front National do disdain the European Union, they're very happy to take the European Union's money, and often for purposes that it wasn't intended for. And both of those parties have been prosecuted for misuse of EU funds, for paying for example, a bodyguard in the case of Marine Le Pen, or for polling for the Brexit referendum. Or you could look at something like Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, who has a populist party there, which is largely based on anti-Islamic sentiment. He doesn't take any state money, which means that he doesn't have to disclose the sources of his financing. But we do know that a lot of that financing actually comes from the US and from anti-Islamic groups in the US, such as the David Horowitz Freedom Center, which provides the biggest ever amount of donation to the Dutch political system ever, about $150,000. So that's the first reason I think why we should be interested in this topic. The second reason is because I believe that populism fuels corruption. And what I mean by that is that it's been mentioned before by Janine, but these parties don't really have a governance agenda. They don't have a program that they want to execute once they're in government. So the only way really that they can reinforce their power base once in government, it's not by their fruits you shall know them, it's they have to close down the space for their opponents in a democratic system. They have to close down any sources of criticism like the media, and they have to close down resistance from civil society, and Jozsef has pointed out exactly how that's done. And that's how they have to do it in a democratic system, because let's remember these are not anti-democratic movements, but they are anti-establishment, anti-liberal movements. So also what happens is that they, as well as suppressing these checks and balances, they deliberately go out of their way to reward friends and cronies through allocation of state funds through the public procurement system. And we have lots of evidence of how that happens, particularly in a number of. So there we can see how populism is, when they gain power, directly promotes and fuels corrupt activities. And I think the last way in which it's related to corruption, or the work of the anti-corruption movement, is the fact that many of the successes of Transparency International and the international anti-corruption movement has been through using the international rules-based order to close down the space for corrupt actors to operate. So what I mean by that is that the success we've had in preventing multinational companies from bribing foreign officials abroad, through the OECD bribery and anti-bribery, or the way that we have closed down the space for kleptocrats to move their money offshore through reforms to anti-money laundering regimes. These are things that can only be done by through international cooperation, through multilateral institutions like the EU. And populists, they want to break down that rules-based international order and multilateral institutions. And so that if you think that progress can only be made through that kind of collaboration, that's another reason to be very worried. Progress on anti-corruption matters, cooperation, and that's really the reason to be very worried about the rise of populism. And I think you only need to look at Donald Trump's recent speech to the UN to realize, what a challenge this movement is to the international order.
Maybe Janine or others, do you want to just weigh in if there's any other elements to this relationship between populism and corruption that you don't think we've raised?
Yeah, so I would focus, of course, what the populism corruption connection that Carl raises is crucial. I mean, in this country, we see Trump not divesting himself of his businesses making that divide. We see him not releasing his tax returns. We see the blatant corruption of appointing people to cabinet positions where the fox is guarding the chicken hen sort of thing. So that's, we see a very flagrant, blatant, really old school style of corruption. But I do think it's absolutely crucial for us to focus on how we got here in the first place, and the establishment corruption, which is a much more subtle model, how that fomented these anti-system movements in the first place. And case in point, as Carl had raised earlier, is the financial crisis. And we see that this Wall Street, Washington network power clique that was responsible for decisions around responsible for, let's say, the bailout decision, which became a flashpoint in the election. We see the deregulation, lack of regulation of exotic derivatives, which and the total sidelining of people who should have been officials who should have been involved in those decisions at the expense of people who were in the cronies, who were in the network. That has certainly been a huge driver of the movement we see today. We see a tremendous growth in shadow lobbyists in Washington. The number of official registered lobbyists has actually declined by 25% from 2007 to 2016. So it's a more subtle but very powerful. The big guys are now involved in shadow. Big power brokers are now involved in shadow lobbying. Than this more subtle way of doing corruption. That was part and parcel of elite, establishment corruption. And finally, to echo what Tony said, that this is going to be, if we don't come to terms with elite corruption, this is going to become much worse. And what we see now is some of the people who were intimately involved in drivers of elite corruption that led to this state of affairs, now kind of calling out the populists and acting as if they had no part in getting us to this place. And that is something I'm very concerned about.
I think I'm going to ask Duncan if you'd like to weigh in at this point, and also take the next question, which it seems, we'd be remiss if we didn't just directly address the nativist element that exists in many of the populist movements we're talking about. And so when we're talking about nativism, we're talking about these, scapegoating and backlashes against groups seen as others, whether they're immigrants or other, of course, perceived as foreign. So just wanted to ask you to kind of take both of those at once. And if you'd like, to display a few images as well, happy to do that.
Thank you. So I think it's time we met the populists. And if you'd like to bring up our first image.
That's all.
Me the populists. So don't worry about the face on the left. These are American consultants. You'll recognize Mr. President. And then as you look at that picture, the left of Mr. President is now called Mr. Aaron Banks. To the right, as we look at it, is Nigel Farage, whose party, the UK Independence Party, I mentioned earlier. And then moving along from Farage is a Mr. Wigmore, one of his associates. And then finally, associate of theirs who worked for Breitbart. Let me start by telling you about Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks is the beneficial owner of a shell company registered in the UK called Better for the Country Limited. This is not a company in the sense that you'll be familiar of, a big trading name. This company was set up about a year before the referendum on leaving the European Union. And by the time of the referendum, it owed £2 million to creditors that had lent money into this company. And what it had also done was spent £2 million on behalf of registered campaign organisations in the referendum. And in structuring this campaign activity in this way, we are none the wiser as to the exact origins of those funds. We have a comprehensive system for declaring the source of political donations and campaign finance in the UK. And yet all we know about this £2 million spent on this, really pivotal campaign is that they were spent by this company, for which Mr. Banks was the beneficial owner. But that company itself had been lent that money. And to this day, in all of the reporting around political finance, who lent that money to Better for the Country Limited hasn't been declared. Nigel Farage had been in the US prior to this visit to meet the president-elect. Earlier in the year, he'd attended the convention which officially nominated Mr. Trump. His program of meetings at the convention, a series of meetings we read in their own account, Bad Boys of Brexit, was attended by his aide at the time, Mr. George Cottrell, who was known to Mr. Banks as well through his work on the Brexit campaign. Mr. Cottrell was arrested that July as he boarded the plane home to the UK from that convention. And in March, Arizona court filings record his guilty plea for wire fraud 2 years earlier. The public documents published by the US Justice Department give a revealing account of his activities in providing and offering to people means through the dark web to hide the identities involved in transactions. And his own public profiles on social media point to associations and interests in obscure companies that have been involved in major money laundering cases revolving from the former Soviet Union, including Moldovan bank robbery. So a very interesting set of skills and knowledge around hiding the identity of people involved in major financial transactions. So what I wanted to share with you, therefore, is that in the competitive business of raising funds for political campaigns and finding ways within the rules of maximizing the funds that could be attracted, these populists found themselves in the company of an aid with a very particular skill set, one which we come across quite regularly in our work trying to prevent the laundering of the proceeds of corruption.
Yeah, and if I may quickly, this also came up in our initial democracy dialogue. Part of my takeaway is that, populists are collaborating across borders, kleptocrats are collaborating across borders. So I think for that, there's that much more of an impetus and need for us to be kind of doing the same for different ends. But yeah, just wanted to.
Absolutely. I don't need to say very much about the next question. I'll let others chip in, but I'm going to share you an image. This was a campaign poster in the Brexit referendum. It's worth saying that there were two campaign organisations campaigning to leave the European Union. one Leave EU, and one Vote Leave. And they ran very different sorts of campaigns, making very different arguments and appealing to very different sentiments. But this poster was produced by UKIP, which was aligned with the Leave EU campaign. UKIP, the party led by Nigel Farage, we saw earlier standing next to Mr. Trump. And this is an image of desperate migrants traveling within the European Union, as that happens, between the borders of Croatia and Slovenia. And you see the campaign message associated with that. And this part of the Brexit campaign was all about making people who feared the other believe that the response to that fear and that anxiety was that they needed to vote to leave the European Union.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to ask Tony and Jozsef, do you want to add anything to just how you identify the nativist and understand the nativist strength of populism? Yeah, then we'll do a few more questions and then open up.
I also just wanted to add just a little bit to what you were saying, and the response to the economic crisis was massive stimulus, right? Which put a lot of money into the financial system that never made it down the main street. The business environment, the economy that it should have gone to help, it never made it there. And it's responsible for the massive disparity in wealth distribution that happened over a very short time. Those numbers went off the roof in the last several years. And so the response to that economic crisis was also contributing to it. Also exacerbates the populist situation because it brought about a ridiculous increase in wealth disparity at the top end. About the nativism thing, I think, we have to look, I think there's a changing paradigm. We often think of politics as being left, right? That's the traditional lens through which we look at things. And I think the paradigm shift is, it's no longer, I don't think, left and right. It's globalist versus nationalist. Right? And I think that's where, so in the United States, you had Bernie Sanders, who probably would have beat Trump, but was a civic nationalist. He wasn't a globalist. And you had elements, whether they be left or right, that were against globalism, and the elites to the average person represents globalism. But they were the opposite of that, and that can manifest itself in left or right. So I think we need to look at that paradigm shift towards globalism versus nationalism as the ideological struggle in the middle, rather than the traditional left versus right model. And in that nationalist viewpoint, it's all about nativism. Whether purely economic, there's in the United States, I see there's civic nationalists, people that are nativistic economically, but not necessarily racially. And then you've got the white nationalists who, carry that out with a very racist goal in mind. And there's often, in terms of voting, and voting power, those two groups often very much overlap. Right? You'll find people on both of those, racist, non-racist, voting for the same populist group, and it's hard to discern between the two because it's all muddled up. But I think we just need to look at things through a slightly different lens to better understand it.
Just two more thoughts, and I'll try to be briefly. So one is about the interplay between populism and corruption. It certainly exists in my country as well. And let me cite just one sentence or one statement of an ideologist of leaders of the governing party, who said once bluntly, publicly, that what the others call corruption, this is the substance of the system. So, which I think shows more than anything else that how corruption and populism and this flawed ideology of creating a kind of new middle class and kind of new bourgeoisie, because that's a cover-up of Fidesz for corruption. So how do they very strongly by the way, this person happens to be now a rector of a university in Budapest. Okay, so that's one thing. About the nativism and populism. So here I would be cautious to put everything under the same umbrella. So I think populism. I think there can be different nationalistic narratives. In Hungary, for example, the Fidesz narrative is very strongly anti-migrant, anti-EU, which is very, very absurd, because the Hungarian economy, as you or some of you might know, lives from the EU funds. 6% of the GDP is coming from the EU funds, and also very strongly anti-Western in the rhetoric. So this is the Fidesz narrative. On the other hand, surprisingly or not, in the Fidesz narrative, it doesn't appear any counter-sentiment against the other countries of the region, which could be based on the history or the traditional roots of the right-wing populism. But it doesn't happen. So that's one distinction. The other distinction is that populism can be also not necessarily a nativist populism, but other kinds of populism. For example, can be an economic populism. Fidesz plays that card very efficiently because they know that people want to get money for free, and they are playing this card. So and perhaps a last distinction between the Polish system and the Hungarian system, which from far away it seems to be the same. There are of course similarities. In both there are a strong backsliding of democracy, rule of law, and the surge of nationalism, but in a different way. The Polish system is a very fundamentalist, ultranationalist system. So in this sense, nationalism and nativism plays a more role in the functioning of the political system than in Hungary. On the other hand, corruption plays less role in the Polish political system than in Hungary, where corruption has become the part of the system and not anymore the dysfunction of the system.
Yeah, so for the sake of time, I'm going to turn it now to Nora and ask you to address two things briefly at once, and then would love to open it up if that sounds good. So we had been discussing before just the power of populist rhetoric, right? And this has clearly come up, whether it's draining the swamp, etc. I think you had some thoughts, though, on kind of lessons that could come from how we can reflect on how is it that this narrative and these narratives and this rhetoric can really move the masses. And at the same time, in a related sense, the last question is, how can we establish common ground between the broad base of people who do have genuine, legitimate concerns about the system not representing them?
So in terms of lessons learned for activists and organizations working in this anti-corruption space, I think there's a few things that we can sort of underscore from this moment. The first being that we should be talking about corruption as corruption, because that's what it is, and we need to be explicit about that. But also that rhetoric in particular does resonate with progressives and conservatives alike, and I'll come back to that in a second. But we need to be very explicit about what it is that we're talking about and use inclusive terminology like that. The second thing that this moment has sort of underscored for us is that we need to continue to approach our organizing and our activism in a very sort of people-first way. And we need to be not just talking about the policies and the wonky side of it, but we need to be talking about how corruption affects people's everyday Americans' lives in in the daily fashion, and how it manifests in their children's schools and in their healthcare and in their tax dollars and in really concrete ways. And we need to be creating as many on-ramps as possible for people to participate in this movement and get involved and join this fight, so it feels very personal and accessible and empowering. The third thing that this moment underscores in our work is that it sort of highlights the viability of our strategy of going around Congress and passing state and local laws to address a lot of this stuff. And this isn't reinventing the wheel. This is a strategy that successful movements have used throughout history, from interracial marriage to women's suffrage to ending prohibition to marijuana legalization. This is looking at who is winning and how are they winning and replicating that success. And this particular moment and this anti-establishment rhetoric does really lend itself to organizing in that same way. So it lends itself to really privileging those people-powered grassroots movements while we're approaching it in a very human, personal way. And in this moment where people are very angry and people's eyes are just wider open, that isn't a shift for us to be approaching it in this way. And the reason I'm referring to it as underscored all of these points is because in the last year, in our chapters across the country, we passed 42 local resolutions. And we, just for context, we were founded in 2012, and we are at just over 60 total, and 42 of those happened last year. And 22 chapters were founded last year. So there's something about this moment and about using this language that is incredibly galvanizing for people and is really resonating. In terms of how to find common ground, I would say that you don't have to look as hard as many might think to find common ground in this particular issue. And the political establishment might like us to believe that this country is insurmountably partisan in every way, but at the grassroots level, Americans are on the same page about a lot of this. And when I before spoke about the word corruption, part of the reason we choose to use that framing is if you poll conservatives and you ask, how important is it to get money out of politics? 53% say that it's very important. If you switch that word to corruption, that number goes up to 83%. And we're really talking about the same thing there. So we have to be just very, very strategic and inclusive and realize that only 25% of the country is liberal, identifies as liberal. And so we are giving up 75% of our population if we don't approach this in a way that recognizes that common ground. And just for sort of proof of concept, in 2014, local Tea Party members and progressive activists in Tallahassee came together to pass the first citywide anti-corruption act with overwhelming bipartisan support. And since then, there have been landmark victories everywhere from Maine to Seattle to South Dakota, where in 2016, voters passed the first statewide anti-corruption act in a state that went 2-1 for Trump. So we don't need to look for common ground. The record is there at the ballot box, and we need to understand and believe that there are things that are shared cross-partisan values here. And one last thing to point out on this finding common ground point is that corruption in the United States does not wear a party label, and that's not to raise false equivalencies, but there are elected officials on both sides of the aisle that participate in problematic behavior and have special interests that have financed their campaigns and their political careers. And we like to talk about gerrymandering and how Republicans have redistricted to favor their candidates, but we have to look no farther than Maryland and Massachusetts and Illinois to find places that Democrats have done the same. So when we're having this conversation about common ground, we also have to remember that both sides have a lot of work to do in improving this, and we have to hold our elected officials' feet to the fire and be accountable across the political spectrum and not act like this is someone else's problem to fix. So I think those are two big takeaways on the common ground side, that we have a lot of work to do together, organizing in a grassroots way, but also we have a lot of pressure we can apply on our elected officials across the board to be better at this.
Yes, all right. Let's go ahead and open it up to the audience. Would love it for each of you just to please introduce yourself, and please keep it brief, of course, so that we can hear from a number of folks. Nice. Thank you so much. Let's go ahead and take a question up front, and then And please direct your question as well if it's so one specific.
Okay. Thank you. Great panel. Thanks for your thoughts. My name is Agnieszka Charowski. I'm from the city government of Argentina. I'm the Undersecretary for Political Reform and previously a civil society person. So this trajectory relates to me a lot with your agenda. And it's two very related questions. One very concrete to Nora, and it was what all these reforms with this pluralistic legitimacy base were about, specifically more beyond anti-corruption, specifically what were they about? And in broader terms, and for those who want to pick the question, is what do you think, and that's why I'm asking this question, is what do you think should be a reform agenda to strengthen what we could call traditional liberal democratic institutions, preventing this idea of populism as a popular reason beyond the institution, something that is above the institutions. What would be a reform agenda that you think would be useful to prevent that?
So the short answer for what they're about is everywhere that we pass one of these laws, it's comprehensive, but it's tailored to that specific location, not just to what's politically and legally feasible there, but to what that community in particular wants, because all of our campaigns are activist driven and our grassroots members are running them. So it's really responsive to matching best practices with what the community wants. That being said, it encompasses ethics and transparency laws, lobbying limits, gift bans, public financing, campaign contribution limits, and a whole suite of policies that, again, we tailor. And we actually, our senior counsel is here and can speak more to it if people have questions after. But it is very specific for each place, but it includes a whole suite of policies. And the way that we approach that question of what the right reform is, to think about the way that candidates run for office is corrupt, and there are things that we can do in that process of campaigning to change that. The way that we vote is corrupt, and there are things that we can do, policies we can pass to improve the voting process. And then the way that candidates govern once in office is corrupt, and there are things that we can do to rein that behavior in. So if we break it down into run, vote, govern, we have specific policies to address what's broken in each of those areas, and in different communities can sort of choose their suite of what is necessary in their community to rein in corruption. But that's the way we'd like to break it down.
Yeah, and do others want to weigh in, especially
I can say something very briefly, and maybe it's about the positive face of populism in Europe, certainly, and that maybe is exemplified by the party of Emmanuel Macron, who's also a populist movement that swept aside the establishment parties. And without answering your question directly about what the reform program should be, which is, would take us far beyond the limit of this seminar, and also, I also want to say that the jury is still out on how effective that will be. I think one of the reasons for Macron's success is the premium and the emphasis that he put on integrity in public life, which is actually an issue which was the previous administration had started to do really good things in France on that issue. And the second issue is also the idea that liberal institutions are worth defending because they can deliver radical solutions. And I think that's one of the things that Macron was trying to get across in his style and in his policies. So without talking about the substance of that, I think that is any kind of reform agenda has to say we're not defending these institutions just for the sake of it. And for a lot of people, I think when they think about liberal institutions, checks and balances, they think of muddle and fudge. I think we need to demonstrate that these can deliver the radical solutions we need to the problems that we face now.
Yeah, let's take a few questions together at once. Yeah, starting here. Yeah.
Thank you for an interesting discussion. My name is Andre Goodfriend, employee at the State Department, but speaking my own name. A couple questions. Populism takes an emotional, victimized us versus a privileged them approach on operating in an environment of rumor and conspiracy theory. The transparency approach is an appeal to reason. Here are the facts, weigh them, and act accordingly. The question, how effective is a rational approach against the emotional appeal of populism? Is one. And then two for Dr. Martin. Hungary's government now is a populist government, but it's also part of the institution. It's become the institution. And it's being challenged by another populist party, by Jobbik, which has a strong ethnic nationalist agenda. How does a battle between one populist party against an institutionalized populist party play out?
If it's okay, we'll take one or two more and take them in a round. Yes, in the all the way in the back.
Hi, I'm Richard Skinner. I teach at Johns Hopkins University, and I'm wondering, how can cynicism, populism, and corruption sort of feed off of each other? Which is to say that if people assume that all politicians are corrupt, then why not just vote for the guy who steals the most? At least he's shown some initiative. Or people assume that the media are all liars, well then who's to say what truth is? And I think we've seen this in a number of countries, populist leaders who are pretty blatantly corrupt say, well, you know, who's the judge? I mean, all my opponents are crooks, all the media are liars. So how can we, you know, work for reform in a way that where you're not just playing into people's cynicism about the broader political system?
Yeah, why don't we give you all a chance to respond, especially I think that question and the one about the emotional power of these messages and how to respond. Anyone who would like. Yeah.
One little quick thing to the cynicism question. We are very particular in our rhetoric about how we approach this, which is that it's not about individual bad actors making bad decisions. It's a broken system. So if all of this stuff is legal, let's just make it illegal. And it's not that people have bad intentions going into politics. It's not that every lawmaker is corrupt. It's that the system enables this bad behavior. So we can be cynical about that, but we can be optimistic that there's a solution that once we put these safeguards in place, people are going into public service because they want to do good, not because they want to be bad actors. And so we try to villainize the system itself and not the people in it. And that sort of moves away from the cynicism.
Thank you. Firstly, to address Andre's remark, I wanted to relay that the information that I shared about the payments from RT to politicians in the United Kingdom, we have because of transparency mechanisms that were introduced both for the European Parliament and for the Westminster Parliament. So some of the transparency solutions that we argue for are contributing directly to the revelation of information to provide some scrutiny over what is happening here. But the dependency that we have, that transparency mechanisms have, is on a public debate and a media that facilitate that public debate, which is conducive to scrutiny in a way that the public can reach conclusions. And Zoe often talks to us about what she describes as the punditry wall here in the United States. We need, as transparency, anti-corruption activists, we need a free media in which people can genuinely explore information that is brought to light by investigative journalism. And where the media suffers and where the resources available for investigative journalism are in decline, then the power of these transparency tools is reduced. On the reinforcing nature of populism, cynicism, Richard's question, we are very careful in our work in Transparency International in the UK, including work like this. Maybe that's quite a cynical front cover for a report, to nonetheless have very practical recommendations to address every problem that we write about, so that there is something empowering, not just for the public, but for policymakers as well, even politicians, to be able to do something about was writing about. And indeed, we find in terms of winning champions for anti-corruption initiative, those policymakers that have been able to do something and take ownership of some initiative are that much more bought into addressing the wider problems that we go on to raise.
Yeah, Tony, and then Joseph, and then we'll do one other round of questions. And again, just encourage you all to stick around as much as you can for our reception and to do more one-on-one.
I wanted to address your question about can you address these emotional things with facts, and what drives a lot of the populist sentiment that we see. People are afraid. Where there's uncertainty and if there's declining economic issues, people are afraid and uncertain about their future, and it is a very emotional argument. And I think just addressing it with facts, you tell them the data that they don't need to be afraid. I don't know that works. I think what does work is making those people feel listened to. And you don't have to accept their fear, but you have to acknowledge it and listen to them. And then you can start to work with them going in a different direction. My daughter has an irrational fear of spiders. There's no statistics or safety of household spiders I can tell her that's not going to make her feel afraid. But if I work with her and acknowledge those fears, I don't have to accept them, but acknowledge that they exist. I think that's the first step that needs to be done. And I think in this last election we saw, there's nothing to be afraid of. The economy is great. Here's the data. Didn't make a lick of difference. At the end of the day, people want to feel certainty. In the absence of certainty, there's fear. And then one last quick example I'll give to that is in Canada, we took 35,000 Syrian refugees. Now, if you look at Canada's population and extrapolate that to the EU, that's about the population equivalent of 700,000. And the government said, we're taking in these people, and granted, we're not walking distance from Syria, so it's a little different. But this is where they're going. These are the programs we have set up. This is how we're going to integrate them. Here are the sponsors. And the Canadian public just went, okay, there's a plan, great. But I think, the challenge that happened in Europe, if there was a plan, it wasn't very well communicated. And in the absence of that plan, people then get afraid and they don't have that certainty, and that certainty very easily transfers into fear, and that fear is very easily exploited by people that want to point to the other. And so I think, we have to work on that certainty and making people feel that they're going to be safe. And we do that by connecting with them and listening to them, not by data. That's my thought anyways.
Just very quickly, and then last round.
So on the question about Fidesz and Jobbik is one of the opposition parties of the Fidesz government. So you said that the Fidesz is an institutionalized party, which is very much true, but I would say that they are too much institutionalized. So if I may say so, because they created effective institutions instead of inclusive institutions, in the sense that the institutions pursue the interests of the political elite, of those who are close to Fidesz, both in politics and in the economy and in the business. And not at least in several fields, they are not pursuing the public good. We have several examples where the institutions do not serve as a vehicle for public good, but for private enrichment. In a way, it's true that this is the race of two populist parties, Fidesz and Jobbik. However, there is a very interesting political dynamic, which basically the essence of it, that Jobbik is moving towards the center and Fidesz is moving towards the right. So they are kind of swapping with each other. And Jobbik tries to provide an image that they are not the same party as it was 2 or 3 years ago. They are responsible. They are already their communication is already a pro-EU communication. 4 years ago, they were burning EU flags. So there is a huge shift from there. We will see where we'll end this attempt of Jobbik going towards the center. At the moment, according to the polls, the voters do not really buy this move. The popularity of Jobbik is rather decreasing than increasing. Seemingly, they lost some voters in the extreme right, and they haven't gained voters yet from the center. So the attempt from Jobbik is clearly to show themselves as not a populist party. Whether it is credible or not, I have more than doubt. But that's their clear political attempt. Meanwhile, Fidesz would not even deny that, as I said in that famous quote, that they are working for a elite change and for a establishment of a new middle class and a new bourgeoisie. So in this respect, they wouldn't necessarily deny that they were popular.
Thank you. Okay, so last round of questions. Please raise your hand high so I can see you. Yes, let's squeeze in these 3 hands. So starting up front here, Alex, and then here, and we'll go to the back. We'll take all 3 questions together, give you a chance to respond, and then wrap up.
So I'm Alex Howard from the Sunlight Foundation. Thank you all for traveling to share your thoughts on what you're seeing. I want to do a follow-up question, which is often my job in DC in the past years. Can you offer specific answers, approaches to what a reform agenda would look like at the state or national level to confront nationalism and populism? What have you seen work? What have you seen not work?
Thanks. Over here.
Thank you. Katrina Rockcliffe, I'm with UNICEF, but speaking with my individual capacity here. It would be also really useful, kind of piggybacking a little bit on what Alex said, to distinguish between authoritarianism and populism. Seems to be that there's a clear distinction, and I would like you to speak a little bit, and then how does it differ between the US and Europe in particular?
Thank you. And then finally, I saw a question over in the back.
Ben Radersdorf with the Inter-American Dialogue. I work on corruption in Latin America, but a question on the US, mostly for Nora. Just on coordination problems in reforms. You mentioned that broad majorities of both parties support getting money out of politics, but presumably members of Congress feel the same. It's hard to imagine that very many of them like spending so much of their time fundraising. But how do you get around the coordination problems inherent there, and anything that you've encountered in your work on, does it revolve around leadership, or is there some ray of hope that can get over that block?
Thank you. Who wants to kick us off, and also, yeah, feel free to take a second if you have any concluding thoughts. Janine? Yeah.
So I just wanted to say that 2 surveys recently, that the corruption theme is ever present in American thinking, that a Chapman University annual survey of American fears for 3 years running has now found that corruption is the biggest issue on people's minds, above terrorism, and above family issues. So it's huge, and it's across the political spectrum. To me, the real work that needs to be done in terms of this populist or anti-establishment and corruption agenda is really mostly on the part of the elites to begin to understand their contribution to getting us to where we are today. And I don't know that we can get beyond this present moment without far more understanding on their part.
To your question, Ben, a few things. So I agree. I don't think politicians want to spend 70% of their time raising money, which is what they spend on average. And I think it's only 0.05% of political donors give more than $10,000. So they spend all of their time talking to very few people to get a lot of money. And I think everyone can acknowledge that's a broken sequence of events. The reason on the coordination, the reason that we focus on the ballot measure strategy is because it seems unlikely that even the reformers among them that don't like this and are outspoken about it, they're in a tough position to try to fix the system that brought them into power. And it's asking the fox to guard the hen house. And I don't think there aren't people there that want to do it, but it's a much better strategy in our eyes to go around them, to have this happen at the ballot box with the American voters doing it and changing the rules so that they don't have to operate in that way, as opposed to asking them to fight the system that brought them into power because they might be compromising their own political careers. They might not be, and some are outspoken about it, and there are reformers on both sides of the aisle that do talk about it, but it seems to us a much more effective way to approach it, to coordinate across grassroots activists nationwide, and share best practices from these campaigns that are right-left coalitions of voters everywhere that we've done this, and have them sort of help us galvanize the spirit across the country, not rely on single elected officials that themselves have their campaign donors to report back to.
Other thoughts or concluding remarks? Yeah.
Just on Alex's challenge about specific reforms, it may sound odd here in the United States, but in London, we, in our advice to businesses on corporate political engagement, we advise against all political donations from corporates. And in actual case, in the United Kingdom, business donations into politics are not typically characterized by large businesses advancing support for their preferred candidates, but rather are businesses which are privately owned or are effectively a tax-efficient route for privately wealthy people to make their donations into political finance. And in that context, we lend our support to others that advocate for much tighter caps on corporate political donations. But in the context of the concerns that I've been raising tonight about interference in our democratic processes from anonymous or otherwise unknown sources, we make a particular recommendation about the way in which we can prevent corporate donations effectively being a channel for donations from an undisclosed source. And one particular measure that we propose which would do that would be to require these donations to be made out of the declared earned profits of that company, rather than, as in the case of the company I mentioned, Better for the Country Limited, payments that were made made possible as a result of loans received by that company. And that makes quite a difference to the ability to move funds into the political process in a way which hides their origin. Just a concluding remark from me tonight. I came here not to accuse individual politicians of corruption or to seek to delegitimize the Brexit vote for the UK to leave the EU, but to share what we have learned about how our very public, open, democratic processes and indeed our democratic space became a playing field for those exploring how to manipulate public votes and the public discourse, and to share with you the consequences that we are experiencing of that. And whatever is passed, I would invite everyone to ask themselves the question,
given what we are seeing, how do we protect our democracies in the future from the potential of the tactics which have been exposed from recent experience? I believe our democracies are worth defending.
That feels like a very good note to end on. Any burning remarks from any of the others? Okay, thank you. Please join me in thanking you so much. So again, please feel free to help yourself to our reception and stick around as long as you're able. Thank you.